Welcome to CSGuitars, the science of loud. Recently, I've been getting into phaser pedals again, and to my shame, I didn't have many in my collection. I've been getting by on the TC Electronics Helix, which thanks to its digital tone print technology is a chameleon of phasing possibilities. I also had the Jam Pedals Retro Vibe, which is an optical phaser, using a lamp and LDR array to generate its sweeping phase. I've got a detailed video all about this pedal up here. However, I've been pining for a vintage-style analog FET-based phaser, something that I can just plug in and get that old-school phaser sound with zero effort. The obvious choice for this is the MXR Phase 90. This has been used by pretty much every legendary guitarist since its introduction in 1974. This is the industry standard sound, and with only a single speed control, it couldn't be any simpler to operate. However, I'm not satisfied with the standard sound. This modern production unit doesn't get the blood pumping to my happy place. I'm looking for some era-correct, slightly obscure phaser sounds that are going to stand out from every other rocker who's got an orange box on their board. So after a little scoping around on Reverb, I came across two additional vintage phaser pedals which excite me a lot more than the Phase 90. The first of these is the Pearl Model F601. Now that rather dry moniker sounds far more like how you would name a fighter jet or a camera body rather than an exciting audio footbox, and the Pearl name is more associated with their drum equipment, so it's unsurprising that there's very little information on these floating around. What I do know is that this was made in Japan sometime in the mid to late 70s, and it absolutely sounds like it. There are some interesting quirks due to its age and the limitations of its time. It's not exactly a quiet pedal, there's a little bit of noise floor on here, and it does take a couple of seconds after powering on to begin working properly, and that probably has something to do with 50-year-old electrolytic capacitors that are starting to dry out. It doesn't even have an indicator light to let you know that the effect is on, something that was, strangely enough, absent from a lot of 70s pedals, the assumption being, of course, that we'd hear that it was on rather than have to visually identify the matter. However, interestingly, it does have a power check light on the side to let you know that the battery inside is still good. Now, all of that might have you thinking, yikes, what a terrible pedal, and that's where you'd be wrong. This thing sounds incredible despite, and probably because of, its flaws. It instantly gets the guitar to sound old. It compresses and affects the signal in ways that 70s equipment was wont to do. Now, this might not be a modern, high-fidelity, transparent phaser, but it does give me that instant vintage mojo that I'm looking for. Of course, I picked up another Japanese-made phaser pedal, this time from the 80s in the form of the Ibanez PT9 phaser. This was produced back when Maxon were still manufacturing these for Ibanez. The die-cast and plastic parts all say Maxon internally. This is from the same line as my favourite ever flanger pedal, the FL9, although as you can see, the PT9 is in far better cosmetic condition. What makes these made in Japan Ibanez 9 pedals sound so great to me is the way that they're able to work within a guitar sound without overpowering it or sounding like a two-dimensional effect layered on top. They have a certain subtlety which gives the guitar sound the extra girth and the lush movement while still feeling like it's part of the original sound. Now you might be asking, as others have when I posted pictures of these onto the CSGuitars Discord, how different can they possibly be? They're all just vintage phasers. There are a number of factors affecting the sound of a phaser. To simplify a phaser circuit, it is a sequence of filters connected to an LFO via some JIFETs. Each of these filters is designed to allow all frequencies to pass through them, and are appropriately enough named all-pass filters, but doing so they shift the phase of the signal. 2 of these filter stages will result in 1 notch of cancelled frequencies. 4 stages will allow for 2 notches of cancelled frequencies. 6 stages, 3 notches, and so forth. A FET forms part of the filter circuit. Its resistance is a deciding factor in what frequencies get cancelled. Connecting the LFO signal to the FET gate changes the FET's resistance as the LFO voltage drives the expansion of the depletion layer. I'm assuming you've all watched my video on how JIFETs work, which in turn modifies the frequencies at which the phase gets flipped, resulting in a sweeping notch of phase cancellation. So the design of the filters, the number of them, the parameter of the FETs, how well matched they are to each other, the LFO itself, and whether or not we include a feedback loop are all determining factors of the sweep, spread, and intensity of a phaser. Obviously, I'm going to let you hear these so you can determine sonically what's happening, but because sound is a little intangible and it can be difficult to describe what to listen for, especially with effects like this, I'm going to give you a visual representation of what these are doing using the oscilloscope. I'm going to be feeding all of these phasers with a sine wave of single frequency, which has a peak-to-peak voltage somewhere in the region of what a standard guitar pickup would output. Now, this isn't by any means a realistic guitar signal, but it does make it very easy to see exactly what these pedals are doing. There are a number of ways to visualize phase changes on the scope. The first is simply to watch how the output signal, shown in green, shifts on the x-axis compared to the input signal, shown in yellow. We will see the output slide in and out of phase as the LFO sweeps the filter through its range. Another important way to visualize phase between two signals is with the use of a Lissajous curve. Here we have the input signal plotting on the x-axis and the output signal plotting on the y-axis. So instead of seeing two discrete waveforms, we are seeing one shape which represents the phase relationship between them. While this is a very useful analysis tool, it kind of requires you to understand how to read a Lissajous curve to get any useful information from it, something that I'm not expecting anyone watching this video to be able to do. I'm simply including it here because it makes very pretty shapes which are hypnotic to watch. This scrolling plot is probably the best way to give you a quick sense of how differently these phasers are phasing. We can pause the scrolling feed and look at the shape the output is making, which gives us an indication of how the phase notches are moving against our chosen test frequency. The shapes that we are seeing are created by the frequency notches sweeping by our test frequency in either direction, the phase cancellation resulting in the drop in amplitude as they do so. The Phase 90 and the Ibanez PT9, while different in their distribution, do share some common features in the pattern. This is largely to do with them both being 4-stage phasers with 2 frequency notches sweeping across the test frequency. We also see some between-notch amplification, which is due to both of these units featuring feedback. The Phase 90 has a fixed feedback value, while the feedback on the PT9 can be adjusted, which shows just how drastic an effect feedback can have over the shape of the notches. The odd one out here is the pedal F601. It has a much simpler shape and sound and indicates that there's only one frequency notch sweeping by our test frequency. This indicates that the pedal is in fact a 2-stage phaser, and the rounded waveform implies that there may not be very much feedback to speak of. Of course, with just a single frequency, these effects sound like a tremolo. All that's happening here is the volume is being modulated over time with this test frequency. A real guitar signal, on the other hand, is never just a single frequency. Even when we're playing monophonically, there are all sorts of harmonics and overtones to the string ringing out that the phaser can sweep across. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators on topics including graphic design and illustration, photography and video editing, and music production and theory. These classes are all curated specifically for learning, so you won't have to endure the interruption of adverts, and there's new original content being created all the time. Recently, I've been branching out into using more of Adobe's programs to create graphical elements and animations for my videos, but that does mean I have to learn a lot of new software like Illustrator, which can be a very daunting process. Fortunately, there are a large number of classes on Skillshare dedicated to this topic, including DKNG's 10 tips and tricks to speed up your Illustrator workflow, which is helping me discover all the keyboard shortcuts I didn't know existed. Of course, if you'd rather just brush up on your indoor gardening or your watercolor technique, Skillshare has classes for those as well. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial, which is plenty of time to learn a lot of new skills. So what are you waiting for? Get lost in your creativity with Skillshare. Finally, let's get some sounds out of these pedals. For the clean examples, I'm going to be setting these a little faster with a little more prominence where I can, so you can hear exactly what they're doing. This would be great for some psychedelic sort of sounds or to emulate wah-wah pedals, but it's not exactly how I would typically use a phaser. I typically place my phaser between an overdrive pedal and the front end of an amplifier set to dirt. Sandwiching it between two distortion stages helps it blend into the signal more, giving a subtle movement without being overly apparent that a modulation effect has been applied. With the speed set fairly slow, this works particularly well for solos and lead lines with repeating legato motifs and tapping. The tone shifts over time even when the notes are going nowhere. If your solos are sounding pretty flat, try adding a slow phaser to give them a bit more life. If a phaser is doing its job well in this context, you will barely notice it. These type of settings allow a lead line to jump right out of a dense, heavy mix without it being obvious that a modulation effect is being applied, which means that you probably hear phaser a lot more than you realise. Those are my new, well, old phaser pedals. Hopefully this has given you some understanding of how they work and how different they can sound from one another. And don't forget to click all the buttons you're supposed to make this video viable to the ever-changing whims of the YouTube algorithm. That's all for now. Keep it loud. Stay safe. Set phasers to Malky.